In the depths of human perception lies a fascinating truth. Much of what we consider reality is shaped not so much by the external world as by the internal processes of our minds. The brain, like a skilled artist, interprets the surrounding reality through the lens of past experiences, ingrained beliefs, and mental models often hidden from our conscious perception. Surprisingly, scientific research shows that about 95% of our thoughts are a continuous stream of repetitions, with a significant portion of these thoughts being negative. This means that our perception of the external world is often just a reflection of internal states and prejudices. Consider this illustrative example. Imagine a situation where two completely different people experience the same fate, being fired from their jobs. One of them, heartbroken, feels that the world has collapsed and all hope is lost. The other, on the contrary, sees this event as a unique opportunity for a fresh start, a change of career, and personal growth. The key difference between these two people is not the fact of the dismissal itself, but the meaning they attached to this event. The first person mistakenly believed that his value as a person was determined by his position, while the second realized that work is just one aspect of life, not defining his essence. Thus, the same event creates two completely different realities, which clearly demonstrates that our reaction is determined not so much by the facts themselves, but by the story that our mind tells us about these facts. And if this story is based on old fears, unresolved traumas, or limiting beliefs, our life may seem much more chaotic and unpredictable than it actually is. It remains to be seen how to change this story and rewrite the script of your life. However, it is important to emphasize that this continuous process is not immutable and final. The human mind has an amazing ability to reconfigure and transform mental models. Once an individual gains the ability to observe their thoughts from the outside without unconditionally identifying with every fleeting idea, a new perspective of responding to the world opens up. The following will discuss in detail why a person, even realizing the repetition of the same mistakes, often finds himself in captivity of automatic reactions. What exactly makes an individual act in autopilot mode, and what strategies exist to get out of this state without losing control of your own life? Surely each of us has noticed that despite a sincere desire for change, we repeatedly return to familiar patterns of behavior. In situations where we are contradicted, when we feel rejected, or when circumstances get out of control, we react predictably and monotonously. However, this is not due to a lack of willpower, but because the reins of government are intercepted by our internal autopilot. The human brain, seeking to conserve energy, turns emotional and behavioral patterns into unconscious habits. A study conducted at Duke University convincingly demonstrates that about 40% of our daily actions are performed not on the basis of conscious decisions, but as a result of automatic habits. This means that almost half of our daily activities are a routine repetition of learned patterns of behavior. Imagine a person whose life is a series of avoiding sharp corners and contradictions. Even at a young age, he learned a bitter lesson. Open expression of his own thoughts and feelings inevitably entails discord and clashes. And now, like a wounded beast, he lurked, preferring silence to a storm of emotions. And now, even in those circumstances when his voice could sound clear and convincing, he keeps a painful silence. Not because it is his will, but because subconsciously he is convinced. Silence is a shield that protects against new wounds. This behavioral pattern, like a deeply rooted weed, has grown in his mind and automated. It manifests itself in everything, in how he perceives criticism, how he reacts to the failures that have befallen him, how he meets face-to-face the challenges of fate. These are a kind of mental scenarios that have been formed over the years and are now played out again and again like a worn-out record, often even without his knowledge. However, do not despair, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. This autopilot that controls his life can be turned off, but this will require a conscious effort. The first and most important step is the awakening of consciousness, the ability to recognize in the moment what kind of automatic reaction is now repeated. With this very act of awareness, a person opens up a space for choosing a different, more constructive reaction. Later, we will examine why desperate attempts to control everything around you only exacerbate this vicious dynamic. We will see how this desire for total control often becomes the anchor that holds a person in the same long outlived situation. In the modern world, one of the most pressing problems is the obsessive desire to subjugate to one's will what is, by definition, beyond human control: the actions and beliefs of other people, the course of events, future prospects. Paradoxically, the more a person tries to keep everything under control, the more vulnerable and anxious they feel. This phenomenon is explained by a fundamental feature of the human psyche. The brain dislikes uncertainty. It would rather prefer a negative but predictable scenario to a situation whose outcome is unclear, even if the latter is potentially more favorable. This is why many people continue to remain in uncomfortable circumstances, in a job they don't like, in relationships that have outlived their usefulness, just to maintain the illusion of control. However, it should be recognized that such control is just a mirage. A person can plan carefully, prepare diligently, and make maximum efforts, but they will never be able to fully control the actions of others, foresee the course of events, or influence circumstances beyond their reach. A clear example of this is interpersonal relationships, where one partner often tries to remake the other, dictate their behavior, words, and decisions. Such attempts are almost always doomed to failure and lead to disappointment, conflict, and emotional exhaustion. At its core, the desire to control another person is an unconscious attempt to cope with one's own insecurity. This behavior pattern manifests itself in many areas of life. For example, people who seek to plan every step in minute detail out of fear of unpredictability, or those who repeatedly reread and edit messages before sending them, or those who painfully try to anticipate all possible scenarios. However, this strategy does not bring peace, but only increases tension. Scientific studies show that people with an increased need for control are more prone to stress and have low resistance to disappointment. It is at this moment that a cardinal change in consciousness occurs. Recognizing the inevitable absence of comprehensive control is not a sign of weakness or surrender to circumstances. On the contrary, it is a wise step that allows you to redirect energy and attention to those areas where a person's influence is truly felt, on your own decisions that determine the course of events, on emotional reactions that shape the perception of the world, and on your personal attitude to what is happening, which colors every moment of life. Being in silence, which at first glance seems simple and accessible, turns into a real test for many people, almost an unbearable torture. Just a few minutes spent away from the usual stimuli can cause them inexplicable discomfort, forcing them to immediately seek salvation in familiar distractions, grabbing the phone, turning on the TV, or creating an artificial noise background just to avoid being alone with their own thoughts. This discomfort that arises in silence has deep roots. When external sounds and images fade into the background, internal noise comes to the surface, exposing exactly what a person is trying to avoid in the daily hustle and bustle: the tormenting uncertainty, the crippling fears, and the unresolved disappointments that poison the soul. That is why silence frightens so many people, because it mercilessly tears off the mask from reality, exposing what is hidden behind the facade of everyday life. Scientists at the University of Virginia conducted an interesting study, the results of which show how strongly people avoid being alone with their minds. During the experiment, participants were asked to choose between two options: spend 15 minutes in silence, alone with their thoughts, or be subjected to mild electric shocks. Surprisingly, many preferred to experience physical pain rather than face their inner experiences. This fact clearly demonstrates how much modern man strives to escape from himself, avoiding meeting his own mind. Often you can meet a person whose schedule is scheduled by the minute, whose life is filled with meetings and affairs, creating the impression of tireless productivity. However, the paradox is that as soon as such an individual finds himself alone, he is seized by an inexplicable emptiness. In an attempt to escape this oppressive feeling, he plunges back into a whirlwind of activity, driven not so much by necessity as by fear of the silent inner space. This endless escape from himself keeps the mind in a state of constant activity, but deprives it of genuine presence in the moment. This lifestyle comes at a high price. Emotional burnout, loss of clarity of thought, and a chronic sense of dissatisfaction become constant companions. The solution lies in a radical change of attitude towards silence and solitude. Instead of running away from them, one should learn to use them as tools for self-discovery and listening to one's inner voice. This is not about hours of meditation, but about gradually getting used to one's own inner rhythm without constantly filling it with external stimuli. Genuine presence in the present moment is not an esoteric concept, but a practical and useful skill that can be developed and applied in everyday life. Being present means being aware of what is happening here and now, without allowing thoughts to wander into the past or worry about the future. It seems simple, but in practice it is quite rare. How often does it happen that a person is physically in one place, but mentally in a completely different one? The reason is that the brain is trained to be distracted. People live either in the past, constantly replaying past events in their heads, or in the future, making plans and worrying about what has not yet happened. A study conducted at Harvard University found that on average people spend about 47% of their time thinking about something unrelated to what they are doing at the moment. And most interestingly, the more often this happens, the lower the level of well-being reported by the subjects. However, there is also good news. This trend can be changed with simple and accessible exercises aimed at developing mindfulness and concentration. Mindful breathing is recognized as one of the most effective ways to achieve peace of mind. It is enough to briefly interrupt the hustle and bustle of the day and fully focus on the act of breathing to stop the irrepressible flow of thoughts and return to the present. Another useful technique is the so-called body scan, when attention is sequentially directed to different parts of the body, allowing you to feel the emerging feelings without any evaluation or judgment. These simple exercises, which do not require significant time, can be performed for a few minutes in between tasks, in the middle of the working day, or between tasks. Gradually, this practice leads to a transformation of perception and reaction to what is happening. A person begins to realize the moments when they succumb to automatic patterns of behavior and gets the opportunity to act more consciously. Presence in the present moment is not just a pleasant pastime, but the foundation for any genuine change in life. It is important to understand the fundamental difference between pain and suffering. Pain is an integral part of human existence. Losses, disappointments, and unexpected blows of fate are inevitable in life. Suffering, on the other hand, is what a person creates themselves, often without even realizing it. Consider a simple example. Two people are experiencing a breakup with a loved one. One experiences pain, lives through grief, allows themselves to feel the whole range of emotions, and eventually moves on. The other, in addition to pain, fuels their suffering with negative thoughts, such as, "I will never be happy again. The same thing always happens to me. I'm not good enough." This additional layer of negative thoughts is suffering, which is optional and only exacerbates the experience. Numerous scientific studies confirm the existence of this pattern. In particular, a study published in the authoritative Journal of Happiness Studies convincingly demonstrates that our interpretation of negative life events directly affects the strength and duration of the suffering experienced. In other words, it is not the fact of what happened that keeps a person in a painful state, but the meaning that they attach to it. It is important to emphasize that this is not about ignoring pain or pretending that everything is fine. Experiencing feelings is an integral part of the healing process. The problem arises when an individual identifies so strongly with their pain that it becomes an integral part of their self-identity. In this case, any change is perceived as a direct threat to their established self-perception. An effective way to overcome suffering is to give pain space without engaging in a fierce struggle with it. It's important to recognize and accept your feelings, name them, acknowledging that the ability to feel is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of being present in the moment. This approach allows you to reduce the intensity of negative experiences. When a person stops resisting pain, it gradually recedes. Otherwise, when they desperately fight it, it only intensifies and becomes entrenched. The prison of attachments extends far beyond interpersonal relationships, taking root in the very core of human expectations and aspirations for predestination. The tighter a person clings to a subjective idea of an ideal life course, the deeper their abyss of suffering becomes when faced with a reality that deviates from the intended path. This applies to a wide range of life circumstances, from collapsing plans and unpredictable behavior of others to frozen images of oneself that are not subject to revision. Attachments, in their essence, are mental shackles that, in real life, transform into emotional prisons, limiting freedom of choice and self-expression. As a clear illustration, consider the example of a professional who continues to pursue a career year after year that has lost all meaning for them and brings only disappointment. They realize this, feel it on a subconscious level, but remain captive to the notion that changing careers would be tantamount to personal collapse. In this case, the attachment is not to the job itself, but to the identity that the person has built around it, fearing to lose face in the eyes of others. Another common example is the attachment to total control in relationships, where one partner is convinced that harmony and happiness will only come when the other changes to meet their expectations. The person voluntarily traps themselves in this exhausting expectation, experiencing constant disappointment with each encounter with a reality that does not match the scenario they have invented. Scientific research in the field of behavioral psychology convincingly demonstrates that the depth of emotional attachment is directly proportional to the intensity of the suffering experienced. This phenomenon is explained by the fact that attachment, like a bridge, transfers the individual's inner world to external objects, to those spheres and entities over which they have no power. Liberation from this dependence, the act of letting go, is not a sign of surrender. Rather, it is a wise recognition of the limits of personal control and an awareness that inner well-being should not be hostage to external circumstances. Abandoning the obsessive idea that everything should happen according to a pre-planned scenario opens up space to perceive reality as it is, rather than as it was imagined in dreams. Do not underestimate the power of inner dialogue. Words addressed to oneself have a tremendous impact on emotional state, decisions made, and confidence in one's own abilities. It is noteworthy that this inner monologue often unfolds on a subconscious level. It is worth paying attention to how a person reacts to their own mistakes. Often the internal reaction boils down to self-flagellation, condemnation, and comparison with others. Such thoughts, which seem harmless, actually have serious consequences. Studies show that people prone to negative self-talk exhibit higher levels of stress and increased vulnerability to anxious and depressive states. It seems as if a ruthless critic is constantly present in the mind, poisoning life. Imagine a situation: a person forgets about an important business meeting. A healthy inner voice would suggest, "How can I fix the situation?" But often a merciless verdict sounds in the head, "You are good for nothing, trust is lost forever." Such self-flagellation not only does not solve the problem, but also increases the feeling of guilt, paralyzing further actions. This is where the process of reconfiguring internal dialogue begins. It's not about self-deception or mechanically repeating positive affirmations. The point is to critically evaluate automatic thoughts and replace self-destructive judgments with constructive questions. Instead of the usual, "I always mess everything up," ask yourself, what lesson can I learn from this situation? At first glance, this minor change in wording can radically change the reaction to what is happening. It is impossible to completely silence the inner voice, but you can change its tone, and this will lead to profound changes. Self-esteem will increase, the attitude to difficulties will change, and the mental state will improve. Resilience is not silent patience, but the ability to transform pain into valuable experience. When this realization dawns, challenging situations cease to be perceived as insurmountable obstacles and instead become stages of personal growth. Consider a person who suddenly loses their job. The initial reaction will likely include despair, fear, and disappointment. However, over time, This experience can become a springboard for positive change. There are well-known cases of people who, after being laid off, started their own businesses, drastically changed their careers, or found an occupation that better aligned with their true aspirations. This path was not easy, but it proved possible and transformative. As a study published in the esteemed journal Psychological Science asserts, people who have weathered severe trials and managed to reinterpret their experiences subsequently demonstrate a significantly higher level of life satisfaction. While it would be naive to believe that the pain vanishes without a trace, it transforms into a powerful impetus for positive change. This capacity for transformation is the dividing line between those who are drowned by life's storms and those who emerge from them tempered and wise. It is important to understand that the issue is not the absence of suffering per se, but the ability to cope with it effectively. In pivotal moments of life, the key question becomes not, "Why is this happening to me?" but "What opportunities are opening up for me in this situation?" It is worth remembering that psychological resilience is not a magic bullet that appears with the wave of a wand in times of crisis. It is a solid foundation that is built in advance brick by brick through small but regular efforts. Emotional self-care, in-depth self-knowledge, and the ability to create a pause between an external stimulus and a response are the three pillars on which psychological resilience rests. The inner world is not a treasure that can be accidentally discovered. It is a building that is painstakingly constructed day after day. Observing one's thoughts rather than blindly following them, taking a deep breath before giving vent to anger, and being able to disconnect from the external world to restore connection with oneself are the simple yet effective tools that shape our attitude toward reality. As an illustration, consider a person who has had a difficult day at work, filled with criticism, pressure, and exhaustion. Returning home, they could give vent to negative emotions and vent them on loved ones who have nothing to do with it. However, they can also recognize their state, take a deep breath, and pause before reacting. This choice, seemingly insignificant, actually has enormous significance, determining the trajectory of their future life. Modern neurobiological research convincingly demonstrates the phenomenal plasticity of the human brain. This means that the constant practice of certain behavioral patterns leads to the strengthening of corresponding neural connections. In other words, the more often a person resorts to a specific type of reaction, be it impulsive actions or conscious responses, the more stable this behavioral pattern becomes in their nervous system. The principles of mindfulness, changing internal dialogue, and the ability to let go of negative thoughts require systematic training. Simply understanding these concepts is not enough to achieve lasting change. It is necessary to actively apply them in practice, realizing that the process will not always be easy and cloudless. It is natural to make mistakes, experience moments of confusion and forgetfulness. However, each time a person makes the decision to return to practice, even after temporary setbacks, they strengthen new neural pathways. This path, step by step, leads them to a state of inner peace that does not depend on external circumstances and fleeting events. This is where all the elements come together. If the reader has reached this point, they are no longer at the same point from which they started. The gained awareness gives them a certain advantage. The decision they make based on this awareness will determine their future path. The inner peace that everyone seeks is not a distant prospect, but a reality that begins with the choice of how to live each moment of their life.